He is one of Canada's most experienced and recognized journalists. He has spent more than 45 years covering news, including 10 wars from all over the world. Until his retirement, he was the senior correspondent on The National, and he continues to appear on the CBC as a foreign affairs analyst, and he also writes a column for them online. He is also a distinguished senior fellow, not just a senior fellow, but a distinguished senior fellow with the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto. Please welcome Brian Stewart.
I've looked forward to talking to Blaine Harden for a long time, not just because he has written one of the most powerful human rights books, I think, of our time, but because his career as a foreign correspondent, a profession I once had, is so distinguished as well. I'll just take note of the fact that he's worked across the world and contributes to Foreign Policy magazine, PBS Frontline, The Economist, has been Washington Post correspondent in Africa, East Europe, and Asia, also a national correspondent for the New York Times. You'll forgive me for stressing the obvious, but in journalism, this is as big league as you can get. This is an extraordinary record. This is likely helped contribute, I think, to a writing style which you'll find in the book is really quite remarkable for the tenseness and discipline. It has a wonderful sharpness and economy of flow. He's also author of Africa, Dispatches from a Fragile Continent, described by the UK Independent newspaper as simply the best contemporary book on Africa, so keep that in mind. And more recently, A River Lost, an expose of damage to the Columbia River. Now, as for Escape from Camp 14, you'll know it's a huge bestseller appearing in 24 languages, universally praised as, again, one of the most powerful human rights exposés, really, of our modern times. When I first read it, I remembered my own first reaction to reading Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago back in the 1970s, though that was a very large book, of course, and this is a tight, narrow book, but both have the same haunting force to them. The story, of course, is about North Koreans' utterly improbable escape from the hell of North Korean prison system. It's all the more powerful because so beautifully written. When you read it, you'll never feel again the same about North Korea or about human resilience in our own time in the face of unimaginable cruelty. Please welcome Blaine Harden. Nice to talk to you, Blaine. One of the hardest things I found to get my mind around in this book is we're talking about an experience that's not really like a concentration camp survivor. Because in a way, this is not somebody who was pushed into hell from outside, taken from a civilian life and dropped in hell. It's about somebody that was actually born in hell. And that there are children actually born in prison camps in North Korea and spend their lives there, may be later executed there. What kind of system puts together a camp like this that is almost beyond human imagination?
Well, this system was not really invented by the North Koreans. It was invented by Stalin. I think that's the best analogy to the Gulag that was created by Stalin. But what's different about North Korea, I think, is that it's lasted so long and that it makes such use of collective punishment. And when Stalin died in 1953, the Gulag had been around for about 25 years after Stalin was dead. The Gulag had melted away, more or less gone. Kim Il-sung, the founder and still president of North Korea, he's still described as the lifetime president of North Korea, he died in 1994. His son, Kim Jong-il, died about a year and a half ago. And Kim Jong-un, the grandson, seems to be expanding the camps. In other words, North Korea has not in any way softened with the death of the great leader. And that's unique for a totalitarian state. A year after Mao died, his agricultural policies that had resulted in the death of tens of millions were effectively reversed, and the policies changed. In North Korea, very little has changed on any front since the death of Kim Il-sung. So what North Korea has created is a system that does not change and that uses collective punishment. The way it works, if I were to say that Kim Jong-un is fat and incompetent in a forum like this, by the way, there are no forums like this in North Korea, I would go to a place like Camp 14. My kids would go. My parents would go. And we would all be there until we died, in secret, in a camp that North Korea says doesn't exist. And if I went there as a young man, say in my early 20s, and I had a skill and worked hard in the camp, they might reward me by allowing me to have sex with another inmate. If under the rules of Camp 14, if I had sex with another inmate without permission, I would be shot. But if I had permission, then I would be allowed to have sex with a woman who might have a child. And that's how children get born in the camp, and that's how Shin was born. His father ran a machine tool device that he did a good job with. They wanted to reward him, and they gave him a woman. And Shin was the fruit of that reward marriage. And he was raised, though, not by his mother, really, or his father. He was raised by the rules of the guards to be a pliable, disposable slave. And that is exactly what he was. And also a slave who snitched on anyone, including his family, so that he could get more food. That was a technique of control that worked very well. And in Shin's case, he was an excellent snitch. That's one of the reasons he prospered in the camp.
Just to drive this one point home again, because it is so hard for mentally to grasp, but I think Kim Il-sung in 1972 decreed that this concept of enemies of class must be eliminated through 3 generations. That means if your grandparents were guilty of something against the state, the grandchildren would still have to be in some way eliminated, from society at least, if not from life itself.
Shin's parents' crimes, he didn't know what his mother did. He had an awful relationship with her. She never told him what she did or why she was in Camp 14. He found out his father was in the camp because his father's brothers had fled North Korea for the South in the wake of the Korean War. And for that, Shin's father's entire extended family was sent to Camp 14.
We've used the term gulag, which someone maybe younger may not realize it is a term meaning really almost a nation of prison camps. And under Stalin, there were endless numbers of camps. And in North Korea, there are these series of camps. We shouldn't think of them as like prisoner of war camps. We're talking about gigantic areas of 15,000 inmates.
Yeah, let me give you a sort of the picture of what the camps are now. There are 6, and they're big. Most of them are quite big. Camp 14 is about 30 miles long, about 15 miles wide, threaded through steep, rocky mountains in central North Korea, about 50 miles north of Pyongyang. There are a couple camps that are even bigger. And inside these camps, there's a series of factories and agricultural production centers. So there's a pig farm, there's a vegetable farm, there's farm for grain, there's a coal mine, there's a factory for uniforms, for pottery, for cement, and several others. And 15,000 people are now believed to be in that camp. When Shin was younger, he believes that there were a lot more than that, up to 30,000. So they are big set, and they produce stuff of some use to the regime, military uniforms, for example. And they produce most of their own food. But the only thing that that Camp 14 imported was salt. But everything else they could manufacture somehow or grow.
What do the children do? What do youth do in these camps? The ones that are born into a camp, that's their life as far as they know.
Right. They learn how to read and write at a rudimentary level, and they learn the rules of the camp, which they memorize, they follow, and they basically do work details. They go to there's a train station there where a train is loaded with goods from the camp, and they pick up grain or stuff that's fallen out of boxcars, and they gather rocks, they chop wood, pick berries, and they do what the guards tell them. What they don't learn, if they're camp-born kids, is they don't learn anything about the leadership of the country. Shin, when he escaped, did not know who Kim Jong-il was or who the great leader was. He'd never really heard of him. And he said that he concluded that because he was a disposable slave, his life trajectory, it was not meaningful, it was not useful to teach him what every other North Korean learns shortly after birth about the great leader. And there are pictures of both of them in the living room of every single dwelling in the country. But he was not considered worthy for even that kind of propaganda.
It's remarkable that the children, too, are kept in a kind of state of complete unemotional connectedness with no warmth, no real mother and father and parenting at all, brutal guards, brutal teachers. Shin remembers, I think, one child being beaten to death in class.
But what's interesting about that, he remembers one of his classmates, I think she was 7, and he remembers she was a very pretty girl. She was found to have had 7 kernels of corn, or 6 kernels of corn, in her pocket. And a teacher, a guard, who was in a bad mood that day, and his mood may have been more important than the rule that she broke, because the guards have complete license to beat, rape, and murder any prisoner they want without any ramifications. Guards have told me that. And Shin said that's certainly the case. So she was caught with these pieces of corn in her pocket, and the teacher invited her up to the front of the room and beat her on the head with a chalkboard pointer until she started to bleed and fell over. And then Shin and a couple other students were asked to carry her home, and she died that night. And what is as interesting as that horrifying scene is what Shin thought. Shin thought that she deserved it because she'd violated the rules that they were taught, and he didn't see it as anything out of the ordinary from what he'd grown up to believe. His first memory, his first light in his skull was attending a public execution with his mother. So he had a world that is, it's almost inconceivable in its lack of morality or love or affection or trust.
It almost makes 1984 seem human in comparison.
It does.
It is really, in fact, the story that is most startling of the whole book is the story of how he informs on his mother and brother, leading to their execution. Could you tell that?
Well, this is the real heart of the book, and it was the most difficult part of the book to report, in part because Shin lied to me about it. He lied to everybody in South Korea. He lied to me when I did a story about him for the Washington Post, and then he continued to lie for a year. So this is what he lied about. He said that when he was in the camp, when he was 13, that somehow people got word, guards got wind that his mother and brother were planning an escape. And they were imprisoned in a prison inside the camp, a special prison, and then he was forced to witness their execution. That's what he said. And that's what he wrote, actually, in a short memoir that he wrote in the Korean language. And that's what he told me when I first met him. But what in fact happened was this. On a Friday night, when he was 13, he was living at a kind of boarding school away from the home where his mother lived, from the house where she lived. And he was allowed to leave the boarding school to go home and have dinner with his mother that night. So he went back to the place where she lived, and his older brother happened to be there that night too. And they all had dinner together, the usual gruel, which was corn, cabbage, and a bit of salt with water. And that was what he had 3 meals a day his whole life. So he ate the usual gruel and he went to sleep, and at around midnight he was awakened to hear his mother and brother talking about escape. First rule of the camp that he'd learned was like the most important commandment of his life. If you try to escape, you'll be shot. If you hear people talking about escape and fail to report it, you'll be shot. So he heard them use that word. He became completely alarmed. He got up and told his mother he had to pee, and he went outside and found a guard, and he turned him in. What happened after that was that he was, the guard told him to go back to the dormitory where he lived and sleep, and the guard would take care of it. The guards rounded up his mom and his brother and took them to this prison inside the camp. But the next morning they came for Shin too. The guard that Shin had snitched to, unfortunately for Shin, had not told his superiors that he got the information from Shin. So Shin was brought into this prison at the age of 13 as a collaborator in a plot that he had squealed upon. And so he was utterly confused by the arrest and terrified. He thought that he just didn't know what to think, and he was almost catatonic with fear. And so they said, well, what do you know about the escape plan? And he didn't know how to answer, and so they tortured him. They burned him over a coal fire with all this. They stripped him and hung him upside down over a coal fire. And he passed out and didn't tell them anything because he was so frightened. After about a week, he managed to explain to them that he had done his job. He had squealed on his family. And so they allowed him to live. So 7 months later, his mother and brother were taken out. His mother was hanged. His brother was shot in front of him. And Shin recalls that when his mother was hanged, she had a rope around her neck. She tried to catch his eye to make some contact with him before she died. And he refused to look at her. He said that he hated her and he was glad she was dying because she had endangered his survival by violating this rule about escape. So that's who he was. But he's also a very smart, cunning survivor. And after his escape from the camp, and during a 6-month period of time while he was in a consulate in Shanghai, a South Korean consulate in Shanghai, in China, waiting to come to South Korea, from conversations he had with the diplomats there and with another North Korean, he concluded that telling the story about his own role in the death of his mother and brother would make him look like a monster. He figured that South Korean police might arrest him, and if people found out about it in South Korea, nobody would be his friend. So he decided before he got to South Korea to lie about it, and he did, very consistently, very convincingly, until he told me, just as we were finishing the reporting on this book, we've been doing interviews for 1.5 years, that he wanted to tell me the truth because he was surrounded by people who he knew loved him and expected nothing of him other than that he get better. And he felt that he owed them the truth. So he told me that story.
It's such a depth of hell that, and we'll come back to the mother's execution later, but one wondered at certain times, I did, whether suicide was a problem in the camps. But then I read of something you wrote, a passage upon Shin's refusal to quit. And so Shin's misery never skidded into complete hopelessness. He had no hope to lose, no past to mourn, no pride to defend. He did not find it degrading to lick soup off the floor. He was not ashamed to beg a guard for forgiveness. It didn't trouble his conscience to betray a friend for food. These are merely survival skills, not motives for suicide.
As you said in your first question, he, unlike concentration camp survivors we know from Elie Wiesel or others, he had no before. He had no context other than scratching out a life, doing whatever was necessary. And I asked him about suicide, and he said the people who had the hardest time with suicide, and other camp survivors have told me this too, are those who've just come, who've been plucked out of Pyongyang, out of a middle-class life, into the rigors of living in these camps. I should give you a sense of just how grim life is for everyone in these camps. You get a change of clothes once or twice a year. Most people don't have underwear or socks. There's no soap. Everyone has body lice. Shin had lice on his body from birth until he escaped to China. People don't brush their teeth. There's no tampons. He describes working in a factory with several hundred women, none of whom wore underwear, and there's menstrual blood on their clothes occasionally. And he didn't understand what that was about, but he could see how uncomfortable they were. And everybody smelled terrible, and people got sick. And most people in their 40s began to hunch over from malnutrition-related diseases of their bones. So they hunched over like very old people you see sometimes. And they die in their mid-40s. So it's the most squalid life imaginable. And you come there from the outside, and you realize that this is it until you die. And a lot of people say, well, I'm going to speed up this process. There was one defector who wrote a book called Long Road Home, who said he threw himself down a mine shaft and didn't die. He just busted himself up. And he said he was down there all busted up, and he was just so depressed because he wasn't dead. But Shin, because he had no before, he had no sense of loss. He never considered it. But one of the things, Camp 14 was opened in 1958. It's still open, and as far as we know, he's the only person to get out. So he is an exceptionally tough, resourceful, and intelligent man. So the fact that he didn't consider suicide may be a testament to the strength of his character as well.
And even he was physically, in many ways, warped and broken. He was smaller than average, as most children are.
He is stunted, and his arms are bowed from childhood labor.
When I was reading that, I remember a discussion on Nazi evil by philosopher Susan Naiman, in which she pointed out that some claim that the real evil of the Nazis was not so much in the killing of humans, but the killing of humanness, that they degraded people to such an extent, they took away their whole humanness. It seems like this is part of the system of North Korea, but I don't know whether it's even it's a conscious effort or whether they just don't care. They just shove the people into these camps, and without any plan other than they'll somehow die and no longer be a problem.
I think from the top, it's the latter. They don't care. But the guards are instructed not to regard their prisoners as subhuman, to regard them as pigs and dogs. And that way, not to trouble their conscience with their death or with their treatment, because they are enemies of the state. The guards, I had a long conversation with a guard who subsequently defected, and when he talked about his training and what he believed and how he treated people, he was a big man with big shoulders, and it was so chilling when he sort of channeled his teachings into what he was telling me that day. But the camps serve a very important purpose in North Korea. They isolate and eliminate those few people who are brave or nuts enough to publicly criticize the government, or unlucky enough to be snitched upon by somebody who doesn't like them. And a lot of people go into the camps for that reason. And it scares everybody else. 200,000 people in the camp, 24.5 million people in the country. The camps are a very useful tool to keep people socially atomized. And what's interesting to think about is that North Korea is no longer a country living with an information vacuum. The border with China has been substantially opened after a famine that occurred there in the mid-1990s. North Korea simply couldn't feed its people. There was a general collapse of the government, and that border was allowed to be more open so that people could go to China, get food, get jobs, send home food, send home money, and it was a relief valve for a catastrophic situation. But after the famine eased, with the help mostly of American food, the border remained semi-permeable. And the economy of North Korea became a scruffy market-based economy that depended on food smuggled back and forth and traded back and forth informally with China. One of the things that's happened since Kim Jong-un has come to power in the past 15 months is that he has substantially closed that border. North Korea is, in a certain sense, less free than it was when Kim Jong-il was in charge, because people could go across that border, and he has closed it.
One of the amazing parts of the story, one that's so amazing, is that somebody who has, again, experienced no warmth, human warmth really in life, no hope of anything, no knowledge of an outside world, absolutely no knowledge of what was where, anywhere, somehow summons up the determination and will to become the first human being born in such a camp to actually escape. And he makes it not just to China, but ultimately to California. It's the most incredible story. Could you sort of condense it?
Well, he was the luckiest unlucky boy in North Korea in some respects. When he was 23, he was assigned to work in a uniform factory where he fixed manual sewing machines, the kind you do this with, if you've ever seen those. He was doing that and tending to the machines of, 40, 50 seamstresses in the factory. And while he was there, the supervisor of the factory told him that he would have an understudy, a man named Park, a man in his 40s, and Shin was just 23 at the time. And the supervisor told Shin to teach him how to fix the machines and find out what Park thinks about the leadership in the government. Snitch on him. And Shin had a track record that he was pretty good at that. He had done it with his own family, and he'd done it with a number of his peers growing up. So Shin tried. But Park was a different cat than he had ever encountered before. Park had grown up in Pyongyang. He'd been educated in the former Soviet Union. He'd traveled all over the world. He was a kind of Renaissance man by North Korean standards. And he was also a pretty kind man. At one point, Park asked Shin where he was from. And Shin was puzzled by the question. He says, well, I'm from here. And so Shin reciprocated and said, well, where are you from? And Park said, well, I'm from Pyongyang. And Shin said, where's that? What's that? He didn't know what the capital of the country was. And Park said, you don't know this city? And so it became, Park sort of asked him questions, what do you know? And instead of making fun of this ignorant young man, Park started to give him a kind of primer about what it means to be a human being on planet Earth. He told him that the world was round. He told him about the existence of China, of South Korea, and of what a South Korea meant, that there was a people who spoke his language, who lived in a country where everyone was rich. And told him about the Kim family and what a bunch of thugs they were. And Shin was incredibly impressed and interested in this stuff, but also a little confused. But when Park started talking about food, that if you could get out of North Korea and go to China, you could be a working person and walk into a restaurant and fill your stomach with grilled meat or grilled pork. And that's what Shin really got excited about, because he'd been hungry his whole life. And he started dreaming about grilled meat. He found it hard to sleep, and he suddenly had a sort of a spring in his step. And he listened to these stories for a few days, and he said, let's escape together. Let's go to a place where I can eat. And he persuaded Park to do it. And they did on January 2nd, 2005. They tried to escape together. It didn't work out very well for Park. He died in the electric fence that surrounds the camp. Shin was supposed to crawl through first, but Park ended up getting to the fence first. But Shin crawled over his electrocuted body, using Park's body as a kind of insulating pad from the live voltage in the fence. Shin got almost all the way through the fence before his legs slipped off of Park's torso, and his lower legs were then subject to very high voltage. And it really ripped open his legs, and he bled a lot. But he managed to get through, and he ran out of the camp. And in 30 days, through a combination of incredible luck and shrewdness, he was out of North Korea.
You know, it's funny. I should know this happens, but whenever you follow the liberation of somebody out of something like that, you kind of expect the bells to ring and a happy story to take place. And one of the most gripping parts of this book is the other side of liberation. That coming out of a hell like this, he runs into a kind of internalized hell that's still with him. So right up till not too long ago, it has not been an easy entry.
It's still not an easy thing for him.
Yet he now has the food. He's gone to Southern California. He has friends, a celebrity now, but it's still not easy.
Well, as I often say, he learns things so quickly. He has such mastery. He's really become quite a sophisticated geopolitical analyst of Northeast Asia. It's amazing. He is completely comfortable with technology of all kinds. He has a giant Galaxy 3GS telephone, but the things that he's still struggling with mightily, and he says this about himself. He has troubles with trust, love. He's nominally a Christian. He has Christian friends and goes to a Christian church, but the idea of God, the abstraction of grace, forgiveness, all of these things don't have any grounding in his understanding of life for the first 23 years. So he finds it very confusing.
The emotion, I think I read somewhere where he has tried to cry just to figure out what it was like, what it would be like to actually cry, because he had no comprehension of what it was like.
Yeah, he told me that in some of our last interviews. He says, I am learning how to be a human being, but it is going very, very slowly. And when he sees people cry, particularly cry, he would sometimes just imitate it to see cry. And he never cried. He never cried to me when he told me stories that deserve some tears, in my opinion. But also, I think that his approach to learning about love and friendship is to study it. And a great example is when he came to Southern California, he was kind of lonely on the weekends because he had a job working with young people during the day at Liberty in North Korea, which is an aid group or a consciousness-raising group for North Korean human rights. But on the weekends, he started getting invitations from a Korean-American family. And the mom in that family was a really good cook. And she would sort of cook food that he liked. American food made him. So he loved really good home-cooked Korean food. And so we'd go to their house. But he found the food to be delicious and tempting, but the family, it was a mother, father, and 2 kids. And it was a very close, very Christian family, and I got to know 3 of the 4 members of the family. And they were very tightly knit. And Shin would go there, and he would study the relationship, particularly between the mother and the son. Because he'd had a relationship between a mother and the son, which was, as we know, it was dysfunctional. It was horrifying to him. But then he saw that they really did love each other. They would laugh together. It was, to him, he really felt like an anthropologist from Mars studying this. And he wanted to try to learn how to do this. And he still wants to know how to do it, and he's still learning.
Is there a psychological name or a term for the kind of condition he'd be in? I mean, it's survivor, some kind of survivor emptiness, or?
I don't know. I read a lot of the literature on trauma of various kinds, but his trauma was it was a life of trauma that he didn't know was trauma, and his guilt is all guilt that's been imposed on him by people saying, don't you feel guilty about what you did about your mother? And my first conversation with him, I think I may have said that in my clumsy journalistic way, something like that. And he really didn't think that way. And he said that he started to feel more guilty as time goes by.
This is an amazing story. It had to be told through one person. But I'm interested now in the writer's craft. This would not be an easy person to deal with in some respects in getting the story.
No, this was a very difficult person to deal with. I did a piece about him. The first piece I did was very easy. We had lunch. He let me go to his apartment. He let me take his picture. In fact, it's the picture on the cover of the book, 3 hours after I met him. And I wrote the story, and it was very prominently displayed on the front page. And it got huge reaction by the standards of newspaper stories from everybody, including the human rights community, which had been trying for decades to get people to understand these camps are open. We gotta pay attention to this. So the human rights community loved the story, and so I went back to Shin and said, let's do a book. And he said, no way. I don't like you, and I don't like journalists, and I don't want to deal with you on a long-term basis in any way. And, thanks for lunch. And that was it. And it took 10 months. And I'd like to say that it was my persuasive charm that got him to change his mind, but it wasn't. It was the people in the human rights community who, as I said, loved the story that I wrote about him and figured that if a story was good, a book would be better. And so they said, you know, if you want the world to understand, if you want those camps to be closed, if you want pressure to be put, talk to this guy that you don't like, the bald-headed guy you don't like. So he did. But even then, when he started, we would go. I remember taking a week off from where I was working for the Washington Post covering Northeast Asia. And I had a very busy job, and I took a week off, and I got a hotel at great expense in Seoul, and for interviews. And he came in the first day, and he looked at me and said, "I don't feel like it today." And you know, I was just panicking because I needed to get stuff and I needed to get going. But he was that way really for 2 years. And so I would get a nibble. And then he would come back the next day and I'd take another nibble. And then he would go back to California and I would go off and do my thing. Then 6 months later, I would start nibbling again. And I would just wait. I had no choice. And then finally, in Southern California, I had several weeks open. He was there. And I remember I mentioned this mom who cooked the good food, who had the son. Well, her son is a brilliant young guy named David Kim, who grew up translating English to his parents who don't speak much English, translating life in America to his parents. So he was sort of a natural-born translator. He had his whole life was preparation for helping me. And he also went to Yale. And he studied, I think he studied literature and history. He had just a wonderfully good sense of English language. And he became a close friend of Shin. Shin liked him because of his mom's food. And then he had time. He graduated, couldn't get a job. So he spent a lot of time with Shin, and then he would do all the translating and I felt during these sessions, sometimes it would last 4 or 5 hours, that I spoke Korean. Because David Kim was so nimble and so psychologically acute that he could follow up my questions and press Shin in a way that I couldn't, because Shin liked him and trusted him. In part because of this food thing. And I was the beneficiary of that. Journalism, as you know, there's so much about journalism that is patience and luck, and being there. And that was a case of luck, and not having completely panicked when Shin would say, I don't feel like it today. And so then slowly it happened.
I want to go to questions from the audience shortly, but just before I do, I want to talk a little bit about the international reaction, the North Korean reaction. This book comes out, instant bestseller around the world, 23 lines. They must have had a fit in North Korea.
Well, you know, it's hard to know what they have a fit about. They have not mentioned Shin by name. They have not mentioned the book by name, but they have done an unusually large number of releases from the KCNA, the Korean Central News Agency, denouncing the slime and the words they use for defectors. And they've done a lot of it, and they've threatened to kill them. And they, in fact, have tried to assassinate critics who've been defectors in the past. So there's some reason to think that Shin is attracting that kind of anger from them.
Does he feel any fear of them?
He has been asked about it many, many times, and he says that, you know, they're not going to intimidate.
Then what can the world do? What is it doing, and what more should it be doing to bring an end to something that's absolutely outrageous in our age?
There are two things that are fairly specific that have happened, in part because of the book, but also last year a book called Hidden Gulag came out, which has the details of 60 individuals who've been in the camp. Detailed testimony, annotated satellite images of the camps they were in. So it gave a kind of evidence-based story behind Shin's personal story. So the two things that have happened in the past year are the United Nations Human Rights Commission meeting in Geneva voted in March to create a commission of inquiry which will basically pull together evidence for possible use as indictments in the international for the Kim family and other leaders in the government. The UN hasn't done this before, and it marks a real stiffening of the international spine towards the regime. And it was a unanimous vote. And the US government policy towards North Korea has been focused for years on nukes and missiles. And in March, the point man for US policy towards North Korea named Glenn Davies, he said that human rights should be also part of that now. And he specifically mentioned Shin in the book. So those are sort of tangible things, but they're not going to overthrow the government of
No,
North
of course.
Korea.
I would have thought that some pressure would be brought on China as almost.
That's what I was about to say. China is, the indispensable patron that supplies all the fuel and a good part of everything else that keeps that country going. China has put up with North Korea because they want a buffer between the U.S. allied South Korea and itself. That calculation may be changing because of the behavior of Kim Jong-un in the past 8 weeks. It's just not clear what China's going to do. Generational change in China. Younger people say, they're more trouble than they're worth. Our business is business, not torturing people. So, China's a big question mark, but it is the most important lever.
People want to ask a question, go to the microphone. Just quickly, if I could, one last question. I asked you in the green room beforehand. I've always wondered, is the leadership of North Korea crazed, or are they in fact in on a giant con here, sort of like leaders of 1984 or something?
I don't think either one. I think they're calculating their own survival in a very narrow way. They saw what happened to the charming Ceausescu couple in January of 19. They were lined up and machine gunned to death, and that had a big influence on Kim Il-sung, who was still alive then, and on his son, and on their approach that if you bend, you die. So they don't bend. And they're calculated, and they're smart. The use of these camps has been an effective tool to keep people socially atomized, even though they're better informed than they used to be.
Question.
Thank you, and I hope my question is different from the last couple you have posed, Mr. Stewart. How many more months, years, or decades do you think the world will be having this regime be perpetuated?
Well, North Korea is more than just human rights abuse. It is a military state with old weapons, but it's a substantial military threat to South Korea, particularly to Seoul. And Seoul is really only about 35, 40 miles from the DMZ, and North Korea has put virtually all of its artillery within range of Seoul. There was a DoD assessment released just last week that said it's old, but it's formidable. And if North Korea were attacked, if Black Hawk helicopters are flown in to liberate those camps, there's a possibility that North Korea would respond with massive artillery barrages into Seoul, killing thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. And that is the blackmail. It's a blackmail by artillery that has been in place and has proved effective. It's been there for decades. It's more important, really, in terms of its potential lethality than the missiles. And the missiles are also worth mentioning because they have hundreds of short-range and medium-range missiles that could hit almost all of South Korea, and very interestingly, almost all of Japan, including Tokyo. Right now, Seoul is, depending on how you measure metropolitan Seoul, it's the second largest metropolitan area in the world. It's half of South Korea, basically. And Tokyo is just a few hundred miles away, is the biggest city in the history of the world with 32 million people or something like that. So you don't have to be very accurate firing these Scud-designed missiles to hit people in Japan or South Korea if you aim it towards those cities. So there's a real military calculation that you can't mess with this place. And North Korea has used that to its advantage by constantly seeming on the, to be a trigger-happy, belligerent, semi-crazy bunch. And that is a pose that is to their benefit for their long-term survival.
I was going to ask you a substantial question, if I can. Okay, now the real comparison is with slavery because under slavery, the slave owner chose your mate and you were born into slavery. The comparison is not with Lenin and Stalin from Slovakia onwards because obviously that didn't happen then. But I'm interested though in something you discussed you mentioned in your book, but you didn't discuss it. Just before he escaped, he went to see his father, and he talked to his father. The fact that he talked to his father meant that, in effect, he was giving his father a death sentence because the jailers would automatically assume that he went to his father and confided in his father. Now, you did not say that in your book, and you didn't discuss it in your book at all. I'd like you to discuss that, and perhaps also about loss of his fingers due to dropping a sewing machine.
Okay. So it's true. A night or two before his escape, Shin had a chance to go and have dinner with his father. His father was in the camp working in another section. He was a laborer. And he went to see his father, and they talked, and Shin knew that this would be the last time he would see him. He knew that if he did escape or was killed trying, that his father would be tortured and killed as a result. He didn't tell his father he was going to go, and he just left. He feels tremendous guilt about that now, and he in fact is trying through the UN to make North Korea is signatory to various agreements, UN agreements about this and that. And one of those agreements obligates them to respond to the kind of suit that Shin and another former inmate have filed to find out about the whereabouts of their relatives. Of course, North Korea is not responding to that. But it is one of the things that torments him. There are many things that torment him. And that is certainly one of them.
Yes.
Hi, Blaine. Hi, my name is Sydney, and I'm a director at Han Voice, which is the largest organization in Canada advocating on behalf of North Korean refugees and human rights. I'm glad you actually made the trip this time. I've known Shin, I guess, a few years now, and I've noticed a huge amount of change. I mean, he's grown so much as a person, as a human being. Just wanted you to talk about, what kind of changes you noticed in him during the time of your writing the book, as well as since then, and also as well since him resettling back into Korea.
Okay, yeah, I'm glad you asked that question because right now he's living in Seoul. He's moved back to Seoul. He is a co-founder of Inside NK, which is an NGO that does several things, but most prominently it does webcasting with other North Korean defectors, usually not camp survivors, But there are now 25,000 defectors living in South Korea, many of them in the Seoul area. And he does the interviews in many cases. He talks to them about why they fled, what life was like in the past back in North Korea, and what life is like and the troubles they have in South Korea. And he's quite good at it. He's, as I said, he's smart, but he's also young and handsome. And he's good on TV. And he likes it. And so that's been a real positive thing. But I think as important is what he's become as a human rights spokesman internationally since the book came out. He was almost sick at the idea that he would become the face of human rights for North Korea. I told him that this was possible at the beginning, and I asked, and he said, that he was a bad person, he was one of the mean people in the camps, and he has no right to be the face of human rights issue. But since the book came out, he's grown into the role, and he takes it very seriously, and he works extremely hard at it. He's traveled, I wouldn't say constantly, but most of the time for the past 14 months, all over the world, talking about, everything, including why he betrayed his mother, as much as he hates to talk about it. And he's been described, Carl Gershman, who is the head of the National Endowment for Democracy, and a very important figure in North Korean human rights, but also he's a Washington institution himself. He describes Shin as the single best known and most influential North Korean in the world. He wrote that just last month. And Shin feels that validated because his suffering and the things that he did in the camp have helped educate the world to the camp's existence. And this means a great deal to him. I just saw him last week, 10 days ago in South Korea. And he really has a stronger sense of himself, more self-confidence, and more happiness in his daily life than I'd ever seen. And it seems to be building. But again, having said that, he's still, as he says all the time, he's still a work in progress compared to other people that he knows. He gets angry, and he doesn't have lots of the instinctive regulations on his behavior, how to manage his money, how to manage his life that other people just know. So life is hard, but it's much, much better, and it seems to be getting better all the time.
Thank you.
Could I ask one more question? Could you share with us the prospects of his story becoming a feature film?
Yes. There's a good chance that it will become a feature film. In South Korea, there seems to be some people who have money and who want to spend it on making the movie. So it seems like quite a good chance now.
Sorry, we only have time now for the next two speakers, please. Sorry.
I want to ask, in the book, he meets a journalist in China, and that journalist takes him to the Korean embassy, South Korean embassy, and you said that he later on got in trouble for that, and I'm just wondering why.
That journalist does not want to be discussed. The South Korean journalist who helped Shin, his role as a journalist was not to take a person into the South Korean consulate, and it appears that he got in some trouble for having done that.
The consulate?
In Shanghai.
The consulate was against him then. The consulate was the one he got in trouble with.
No, he got in trouble, I think, with his employer and with because he just was doing something that a journalist shouldn't do. And so he has been very, very, very reluctant to talk about that whole incident. And he does so under confidentiality.
Last question.
Hey, I have a rather general question. In the last part of the book, when Shin escapes and he's going through North Korea on his own, he sees a lot of North Korea that's completely different from camp. He learns about the leaders. He learns about how people have been moving in and out of China. And you talked about how the borders were opened a little bit. How aware is the average North Korean of life outside of North Korea and how, like, their own plight? I'm not sure. I've always wondered about that because I saw a TED Talk recently with a relatively famous North Korean defector. I think her name was Hyun-So Lee. And she talked about sending money home to her family and information, and I didn't realize it was that permeable or that easy for them to do that.
Right. You really should understand that since that border with China opened up after the famine in the late 1990s, that North Koreans are dramatically more informed about the outside world and about the role and failure of their government in the world compared to South Korea and China. Thousands and thousands and thousands of radios have come in. And the US from Mongolia and South Korea from South Korea bombard the place with very powerful radio signals that are at great pains to point out what's going on in the rest of the world. So there are really millions of people who listen to those radios regularly now in South Korea. And so they know a lot more than they did before and a lot more than I think the world gives them credit for. Having said that, however, they remain socially atomized. They cannot communicate, they cannot meet in groups like this, they cannot communicate with, there's no internet, there's no tweeting and that sort of thing. And people still have trouble traveling, although those rules have loosened a little bit too. And the camps, as I said, have not in any way diminished. And the threat of them remains just as real. So people have more inside their heads, but they're not sharing it with each other because they're afraid.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, Blaine Harden, it's an extraordinary tale, brilliantly told. You really, it shocks me that I was so shocked, quite frankly, at the depth of those camps and the degree of horrors that continue there. You've done a tremendous service bringing this to the world's attention. It's a must-read book. I absolutely recommend it very highly. It is a powerful book, and I thank you very much for bringing it to our attention and you to our presence.
Thank you.